Okay, thank you all very much for coming to this meeting of Warwick District for Europe. We're a branch of European Movement, which is an international organisation with branches in all over Europe. And we're here today to talk about Brexit and the environment, climate of change. What does Brexit mean for environmental policy in the UK? How does the UK's Environment Bill stack up against the EU's Green Deal? And the environment is something that crosses borders and isn't under control of any one country. So it was clearly a key area of European cooperation that the UK is no longer directly involved in. We have two speakers, Natalie Bennett, former leader of the Green Party and member of House of Lords, and Emilien Gasc, the Climate and Environment Officer at the Delegation of the European Union to the United Kingdom. They're both going to speak. Emilien will go first and Natalie second, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. Just a reminder, we are being recorded, so if you don't want to appear in the recording that we made public, turn your camera off and change your name. We'll get underway. So Emilien's going to speak first. Emilien Gasc is the first secretary and the Climate and Environment Officer at the Delegation of the European Union to the United Kingdom, where he has been for the past 7 months. Before that, he worked for the European Commission for nearly 8 years, where as policy officer, his areas of responsibility included air quality, industrial emissions, plastic strategy, circular economy, and ship recycling. He has master's degrees in public administration, international law and security, and in European affairs. And he studied environmental policy at the University of Melbourne. So I'm very pleased to welcome Emilien, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for this introduction. I was reminded, in fact, of some of the masters I have, so thanks for that. It's been a while already. No, so thank you, and to Hazel for inviting me to give this presentation and exchange with you, and I'm also very privileged to share a platform with Natalie Bennett. So I want you to do 3 things. First is to give a very quick overview of how our environment is doing, especially in European environment. Secondly, explain a bit what's led to the Green Deal and what the Green Deal is. And finally, give a very broad overview of what the Brexit deals, I should say, plural, say and do about the environment. And there'll be a few slides here and there, but not just. So yes, as you said, Peter, I arrived in London in September as part of the new EU delegation to the UK. The EU delegation, as you know, is a new thing. It opened in February last year, 1 day after Brexit. So it replaces the former Commission representation to the UK. It's mostly new staff, and we are more and more. I think we're about 45 now in the delegation. It's one of the 140 such delegations in the world. Yes, I cover climate and environment. There's a very positive agenda, of course, on the one side with COP26 collaboration, and another side of the agenda, I suppose, with the follow-up to Brexit. A couple of things first on the environment. I suppose most of you are familiar with this, but what's happened essentially since the 50s is we've had a period of great acceleration, if you like. Global population has tripled. We are 7.5 billion. The population living in cities has quadrupled. Our economic output has expanded 12 times. But at the same time, our use, for instance, of nitrogen, phosphate, potassium fertilizers has also increased five times for energy use as well. And looking ahead, these pressures on the environment will continue. We should be about 10 billion by 2050. Water demand will increase by 55% in the same period. And what that already means today is that our environment has been severely altered by these processes. We think that about 75% of the terrestrial environment and 40% of the marine environment are in a dire state of things. More so, the Earth has experienced impressive loss in biodiversity to the extent that we believe, and scientists believe, that we are going through a sixth mass extinction. And to give you an idea, the fifth one was the dinosaurs. So it's not exactly something that happens frequently, and we are in a truly exceptional period in that regard. Now, it's not just nature. All these impacts and these pressures of our society on the environment also have a disease burden. The combined effect of environmental pollution is understood to be 3 times greater than the combined effect of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. And I'm talking here, for instance, of air pollution. So what's been the role of Europe in all that? Well, not a great one, to be honest. Europe has played a pivotal role in the Industrial Revolution, and that has shaped these global changes I just talked about. But even today, we actually continue to consume more than most of the regions in the world. And more importantly, our resource use taking place in the third countries is also massive. And that's something we're trying to tackle now, and I'll explain that in detail later on. So most of our impacts now occur outside Europe. So the state of the environment in Europe now, and there's a good source for that. It's our European Environmental Agency based in Copenhagen. It's hundreds of scientists who themselves rely on a network of scientists throughout 32 countries, and the UK is not part of these anymore. And what they say is pretty clear. We have challenges on an unprecedented scale, and I mentioned the biodiversity enormous challenge. But they also say that time is running out to act and to come up with credible answers. Now, there are some things we've done well, and I will go through some of them, but essentially, we are facing persistent challenges. Biodiversity, resource use, the impacts of climate change, and as I said, the environmental impacts on health. It's looking quite clear now for our own agency that we will not meet most of our 2030 and 2050 targets. At least we are not on a trajectory to that, and we're trying to change the trajectory, but the outlook is not looking great. So what have we been doing well? One thing we've been good at, I suppose, is reducing emissions overall, whether they are climate emissions or pollutants emissions, and particularly from well-identified sources. So whether it's the carbon emissions from the over 11,000 heavy industry plants that are covered by the European Emissions Trading Scheme, or whether it's the pollution from these same plants to water, to the air, or typically the quality of drinking water has greatly improved. The quality of bathing waters is also much better than it was just 20 years ago. We've had some success on biodiversity. Some species have recovered. And it can be argued that we have become more resource efficient. So we are using a lot of resources, but our economic growth has been faster than that. It's the whole debate on decoupling. And I know that it's a controversial debate on are we actually decoupling or not, or are we shifting some of that consumption and production pressure on other countries. Our greenhouse gas emissions, so on climate change front, have decreased. They have declined by 22% since 1990. And our water abstraction has also fallen about the same proportion around the same date. What's been much more difficult, and you have a full list of what's been more difficult. The first one is the diffuse pollution, pollution from more scattered sources. What's also been difficult is the scale effect, if you like. So to give you an example, it's all and good to have more demanding standards on the pollution or the emissions of individual cars. But if there are more and more cars, or if people use larger and larger cars, then we have an issue. Typically, for air quality, that also applies. Yes, we have reduced emissions of air pollutants, but as more and more people live in cities, more and more people are exposed to concentration problems. And that's something that is still causing a little under 400,000 premature deaths in Europe every year. Another difficult thing is tackling the legacy of past damage. So there is still a lot of persistent pollution. Some persistent chemicals resist even the most advanced water filtering techniques. And you can apply the same to nature. It's one thing to protect nature and to stop the extent of damage. It's another to actually restore what's been damaged. And that's something we're trying to make progress, but it's much more difficult. And finally, I mentioned the big question of the impact of our supply chains on the rest of the world. And here, as part of the European Green Deal, we're proposing two things this year. First, an initiative on deforestation across supply chains, and that will be in a few weeks. And by the end of the year, an initiative on sustainable products, so to reflect the impact of supply chains much better in our legislation. Now, at this point, I'd like to share a first slide to show you the gap between what we want to achieve and where we are actually. So what you see here is from our European Environment Agency. And it looks at item by item, so terrestrial protected areas, marine protected areas, etc., per big headers. And we look at the trends of the past year, that's the first row here, and the outlook to 2030. And what strikes you is that we've actually made some good progress in about half of the fields in the past years. But even for these, the outlook is not looking great. Outside waste management, in fact, the outlook is looking neutral to bad. And that's a reflection of the fact that we have captured a lot of the low-hanging fruits, if you like, but now we're entering in the difficult zone of tackling the remaining issues, which are still enormous. Now, for most of these areas, we have legal goals and targets for 2028 in water, for 2030 in recycling, some of them 2025. And what our own agency is telling us is that at the current pace, we are going to miss out on these targets. Now, I will stop sharing for now. And I'll explain to you a bit how we got to the Green Deal, the Green Deal of December 2019. I guess there's one narrative in the fact that the European environmental policy so far had been a bit piecemeal, right? Addressing one parameter, one source of pollution, etc., and it was not really holistic so far. Now, there's some truth to that, but that's not necessarily the full picture. The importance of tackling environmental damage holistically was clear from the 60s, from the 70s. It's not a new thing. It's not new with the Green Deal. And it was to an extent reflected in our policies as well. Since 1973, we've had these European environmental action programs that try to take the long view on what's needed to protect the environment and restore the environment. But in practice, it is true that for a long time, it was easier to act on the most visible and easiest parameters to tackle. And that's typically drinking water and here and there actions on these or that pollutant. But really in the past 10, 15 years, we've had much more holistic strategies on sustainable consumption and production, on circular economy, on the bioeconomy, the plastic strategy from 4 years ago. We had a first circular economy action plan in 2015. We now have a new one since a year and 2 days, in fact. And what the Green Deal does is confirm that approach and take it one step further and I explained to that, to take it to other fields than strictly environment, if you like, to reflect the fact that the environment is not a policy on its own. It is to an extent, but it's also a concern typically for agriculture, for transport, etc. We've had, you may be aware that we have 2050 carbon targets, right? The famous now net zero target. It's also a target for the UK, but that's not the whole picture. We've had for years another target for 2050, and that's where I'll share my screen again, a much more broad European target for 2050. And that's the one. That's the target you find in the Environmental Action Programme since a few years. And it's quite poetic almost when you think about it. Our target for the EU by 2050 is to live well within the planet's ecological limits and to have prosperity and healthy environments stemming from innovative, circular economy where nothing is wasted, where natural resources are managed sustainably and biodiversity is protected, valued, and restored in ways that enhance our society's resilience. We have a low carbon growth that's been decoupled from resource use, and that sets the pace for safe and sustainable global society. So you see that captures everything, and that's been our official target for 2050. The net zero target, if you like, is only a subset of that. So now the Green Deal itself. Green Deal, two things. It's a wish of the new president of the Commission back then in 2019, Ursula von der Leyen, and she identifies it as a new growth strategy for the EU. So it's to explain that there is no other growth than green. It's managed by the first Executive Vice President Timmermans, who is the Vice President of the European Commission for the Green Deal. And he obviously shares that vision, and he also insists on the fact that what's very important as we transition towards this 2050 vision I described, that we do it in a just manner that leaves no one behind. What's very important for us is that this is not a negative agenda. There are plenty of opportunities, and also, and it's important to make it clear to them, also for our businesses. The renewable energy revolution is one. The scale at which we have transitioned, and we are transitioning to renewables, is incredibly fast. Just some years ago, very few people could have predicted that we would have the kind of energy mix we have today, with such big reliance on renewables. What's also important in the Green Deal is to reduce our dependency on imports from abroad. And that's from other non-EU players who might not always have our own best interests at heart. And if we can be more self-reliant energy-wise, we also have a safer place geopolitically, if you like. And one of the big chapters of the Green Deal, one of the big initiatives, and one of the very first on which we delivered, is this concept of the circular economy. So we had a first go at it in 2015, and now we have a new circular economy action plan since last year that takes things much further. And the idea here is that if you have an economy that is less linear, meaning you extract, you produce, you use, and just throw away, but instead of that, you try and reuse as much as possible the waste and reinject it into the economy, you can have benefits on every front, on the climate front, on the job front, because it's very, very local jobs that are needed to make that work, and savings across the board for consumers, for companies, for institutions. So the Green Deal, I'll give you the main logic of it. On the one hand, it's about transforming the EU's economy for a sustainable future while leaving no one behind. For that, four things. First, the policies, so our core business, if you like, deeply transformative policies, and I'll give you some detail on that. And secondly, very important, the mainstreaming part. Again, the point of showing that environment policy is not a silo. It has to be everyone, every department's concern. And I mentioned again agriculture and transport. For a third pillar, financing the transition. So that was then reinforced by our recovery plan from COVID. Our recovery plan from COVID is in fact the funding plan for the Green Deal. That's been made very clear by our leaders. The Green Deal is at the center of the recovery plan. And the last point on leaving no one behind. What we mean by that is typically, as we transition to a cleaner society, yes, there will be companies, there will be regions where there will be job losses at first. And the idea is to really focus on reskilling, and if and when that's necessary, in fact, bridging the gap between the current state of things and the future transition job market by financing directly the conversion, acting as a safety net. And that's very important. We have at the moment high support from European citizens. It's actually the most supported policy of the EU. It's important not to lose that, and not to lose that, you also want to make sure that no one suffers from this transition on a personal level. Connected to that as well is the idea of the EU as a global leader. That's another of the priorities of the president. And what that means for the Green Deal is that we have a lot of proactive diplomacy, selling the merits of the Green Deal, selling the merits of circular economy to the rest of the world. And we have what we call a European Climate Pact since 3 months. That's a way of systematizing the involvement of stakeholders citizens' youth movement into what we are doing, but also what nations are doing, what regions are doing, and what the local level is doing. So we propose tools and support for this involvement of the civil society. The 8 pillars, I'm not going to name them all, but just to show you how mainstream this effort is, and that's one of the advantages of being very clearly supported by the high leadership, is that every department, as I said, has to take that into account and to make it their own. We have obviously, as part of the Green Deal, an increased climate ambition. We have now these new targets for 2030. We have this net zero target for 2050. That's a result of the Green Deal. Securing much cleaner energy, so that's for our energy department to implement. We have a new sustainable mobility strategy to try and move away gradually from the whole car-based economy to have much more soft transport, rail transport. We have what we call a renovation wave. Renovation wave, just like in the UK with the thinking of the Climate Change Committee, it's so important. It's one of the first things we need to do, renovate the building stock. I think in the UK, the target is typically to install 800,000 heat pumps by 2028. There is so much to do here, and it's one of the emergencies as well. And perhaps Natalie will want to discuss the Green Home Grants system or the debate in the UK on this. That's one point. Fifth point, the zero pollution ambition. So that's the idea of trying to take a leap forward on everything pollution, air pollution, water pollution. We've made progress, but as I said, concentration levels remain problematic. So by May or June at the latest, we will have a zero pollution action plan that basically reviews all our policies to take them one step further. So typically on air quality, that means we will go and endorse as our eventual objectives the WHO, World Health Organization recommendations for limit values and concentration values for most of the harmful pollutants. We have a biodiversity strategy since last year, and that will guide our participation in the big the biodiversity COP in China in September, if all goes well. You know, there are 3 COPs, in fact, this year. There's the Glasgow Climate COP, obviously, but there's also the biodiversity COP in China, and there's a desertification COP. And that's where we will push our objective of guaranteeing at least 30% of our environments protected for biodiversity. And the rest, of course, does not mean that the remaining 70% can be damaged. For this, there will still be safeguards, but the 30% will need to be in a pristine state almost. One of the most fascinating aspects, and that's not really my field, is what we call the farm to fork strategy. That's also something we published last year, is to tackle head-on the issue between agriculture and environment. So it's looking across from extraction of goods from production on the farms all the way to supermarkets and in the consumer's plates, everything that can be made greener. And the point here is that it's not just a consumer responsibility. If you look at the question of food waste, on which we are really pushing, there are 2 legs. Yes, there is what consumers don't eat, and there are things to do on that front. But there's also a lot of food waste before that, restaurants, supermarkets, but also at farm level. And there's a number of actions that can be taken there. It also regards our attitude and our relation to pesticides. That's all in the farm to fork strategy that's being implemented now. Voilà. Now, I've finished on the state of the environment, a bit what the Green Deal is about, and I will finally, for my last segment, if that's okay, say a bit on the subject for today, Brexit. So you know that Brexit is in fact a series. There's no one Brexit deal. There are at least 2 families of deals. There's the divorce agreement, if you like. That's the withdrawal agreement, and it's Northern Ireland Protocol. And then there's the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So that's the deal that was achieved late last year, this EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now, all of these are relevant for the environment. You don't need to read the whole table, but basically you will find things related to the environment in all instruments. What's important on the left, I suppose, if everything, but what's particularly relevant, I suppose, is the ongoing cases, European Court of Justice cases, the old cases. They do not disappear just because Brexit has happened. Some of them are still relevant, and the treaties plan for that. The Northern Ireland Protocol suggests that, in fact, most of Northern Ireland environmental and climate policy remains the EU's. That's typically the EU emission trading system will still apply to power plants in Northern Ireland. And that comes with a raft of issues, as we've seen in the news, and you have seen in the news recently. But that's what was agreed between the two sides, notably to avoid having a hard border in Ireland between North and South. Then there's the whole aspect of what's covered in the TCA, so the future-looking agreement, if you like, the actual deal. And here, the key issue on which I will focus is what we call the level playing field. So the idea is that on the environment, both sides agree that it's a very important field. None of them wanted to regress. So what we've agreed is that between us, there will be a level playing field for competition and trade. And that means that one side should not be able to abuse the environment to gain an advantage in trading with the other. What that means in practice is this first red block, a non-regression commitment. So the EU and the UK have agreed that the state of things on 31st December last year is a baseline. No side can regress from that and set typically environmental standards that are lower than that. There's a few caveats and things to say about this. First, what we're looking at is the level of protection. So it does not mean that UK and EU must have the exact same wording, the exact same instruments, the exact same processes. But at the end of the day, the levels of protection of the environment must be similar. There is then a caveat that we still don't know how big it is, but there's a trade impact test. That means that all this discussion on non-regression is only applicable to these areas that have an impact on our trade relation, meaning that in theory, there could be environmental standards that have no bearing at all on the competitiveness of one side or the other in the trade relation, and these would not be covered. In practice, however, it's quite wide, the level playing field leg of the environment. It's hard to imagine any aspect of environmental policy that is not in one way or the other connected to trade advantages. Third aspect, obligation to enforce. So it's not enough to say, well, we won't regress from now. We actually want guarantees. Both sides wanted guarantees that the other side will continue to enforce their obligations. What's also interesting is the wide scope of this non-regression commitment. In line with what we've discussed before on mainstreaming the environment to agriculture, etc., we're not only going to look at the strictly environmental policies, but things like GMOs, things like agriculture, and their impact on the environment, and in fine, their impact on the non-regression commitment. So the next question is how to maintain this level playing field. And here there were two options. The first option the UK side was not interested in during the negotiations was some sort of automatic alignment, right? Dynamic alignment. So whenever one side would increase their environmental standards, the other side would have to follow. This is something we proposed and the UK refused, but still we have some agreement on the future proofing. First, we will have a similar 2030 targets on the areas I mentioned before, on air, on water, on climate. Secondly, and that's a very important one, there are rebalancing measures. So what that means is that if one side improves their environmental standards and the other does not, then the first side can rebalance. That means retort, if you like, in one area, any area of the trade relation, to set limits to the trade. If we say if the EU improves one policy, has stricter standards on air, the UK does not follow, and we believe this gives the UK an advantage in the trade relationship, then we can rebalance by targeting another area, and that can be anything, to restore the balance. Overall, there will be a review, a discussion in 2025 on how well this level playing field has worked. Now, especially for rebalancing measures, it's not all unilateral. It's unilateral at first, the EU or the UK could activate it, but there are governance arrangements, and that's my last bit. There will be a binding level of experts to review what the other side is doing. The rebalancing measures themselves will be subject to a panel of arbitration. So you can use them at first, but after a few weeks or months, a panel of experts would review the decisions and come to a decision, and there would be discussions. And perhaps more importantly, and I think that will take part of my time, for instance, in the coming years, there's a lot of cooperation embedded in the TCA. There's a supervisory cooperation, so it means that the European Commission will continue to meet the Office for Environmental Protection when it is set up in the UK. And there's a whole committee structure. It's co-chaired at the top by Maros Sefcovic on our side, and now David Frost on the UK side. That's a high level, but below them you have literally dozens of committees, and one of them is on level playing field for the environment. What's not in the deal? I mentioned that to you. The UK has decided not to be part of the European Environmental Agency and its whole monitoring network. They can still feed in if they want, but not access some of the resources they've chosen not to access anymore. There is no access, obviously, to our environmental committees or databases. That's where many decisions on the future European directives, etc., are taken. Caveat that I mentioned before, Northern Ireland, to an extent, remains involved in these, for Northern Ireland, there is an involvement in these structures. An overview now on, and that's, I think, my penultimate slide, the overview of the relation. In red is where the European Union and particularly the European Commission will have a supervisory role. So that's everything regarding the divorce agreement, this withdrawal agreement. We'll have a direct role in the supervision of what's going on with the Northern Ireland Protocol, with the ongoing legal cases that I mentioned, and with the LIFE projects. So that's where the EU money is still invested in UK-run projects for nature, and we have a right to see that the money is used properly. In yellow is where we have a scrutiny role, so where we only follow what's going on, we don't necessarily give orders. So that's the involvement in the level playing field specialized committee I just mentioned to you. There's this cooperation between the OEP when it exists and the European Commission, and separate discussion on Gibraltar. And finally, to have something more positive, there's actual cooperation. The TCA does list a number of areas where both sides agree that it's very important to cooperate. That's chemicals, that's energy policy, typically in the North Sea, how do we share that properly? And everything that comes from multilateral environment agreements. We still want to have a very close relationship with the UK when we are talking on the international scene. It can be many, many things. There are many international agreements on the global stage. One of them, for instance, I'm familiar with is the Basel Convention on the export of hazardous waste outside Europe and outside the OECD. And to finish, climate cooperation. So it's not just about the environment. We have agreed, both sides agree, obviously, that the climate is very important. Both sides have agreed that they will maintain an effective system of carbon pricing, and there is a potential for relinking our emission trading systems. The UK used to be part of the European emissions trading system. They have now set up their own, the UK ETS, that started working on 1st January. And there is potential to re-merge them in the future if the conditions are met and if the parameters are just as demanding on both sides. Voilà, so sorry, that was a bit long. I hope it was helpful, and I don't know, Hazel, Peter, how do you want to go first, Natalie, or I'm happy to take questions at any point.
Thank you very much, Emilien. I think we'll push on with Natalie and take questions at the end, if that's okay. So let me just introduce Natalie. Natalie was appointed to the House of Lords in September 2019. From 2012 to 2016, she was leader of the Green Party. She has a degree in agricultural sciences from the University of Sydney and in Asian studies, and a master's in mass communication from the University of Leicester. She's worked on farms and as a journalist for the Bangkok Post, the Telegraph, the Independent, the Times, and was editor of the Guardian Weekly. She's a member of the board of European Green Journal, and she'll be talking to us about the UK's environmental bill, the political risks posed by Brexit, and opportunities for the future. So over to you, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And Peter was asking me if there was kind of anything interesting or my background. And one of the things that when I was first elected as leader of the Green Party, the media got very excited about the fact that I was probably the only British political leader who knew how to shear a sheep. That's the ag science degree and the working on farms. But I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. If, like many of us, your life is Zoom calls, to join another Zoom call on a Saturday morning shows real dedication. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, Emily, for that very encouraging and discouraging at the same time presentation. Just to pick up one point that you referenced about decoupling, and that's a very important issue about the question about whether we can continue to have economic growth. And I'd point people to Tim Jackson's excellent book, Prosperity Without Growth, anyone who's interested in this, because in that, it's a little old now, but it demonstrates an essential truth that Greens have always known, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And if you look to mention another book, I strongly recommend Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, which works very much with the concept of planetary limits. And, you know, the climate is just one of the areas in which we're at or exceeding the planetary limits. But I mean, one of the things that really struck me about the presentation is the coherence of it. Europe, however imperfectly it might be delivering on it, really does have a plan and a sense, an overall coherent set of narratives. And you can find such a thing in the UK, and I'll put some of the documents I'm going to mention, I'll drop in the chat box afterwards, some links. You can find a coherent approach like that in the Independent Committee on Climate Change 6 carbon budget. That tells you how we get to net zero carbon by 2050. And it also, at least to some degree, deals with some of the other issues of all of the other resource limits, the planetary limits we're butting up against. However, that is an independent document. The Committee on Climate Change is not the government. And it treads a very thin and interesting line. The chair is Lord Deben, who some might remember as John Gummer, the long ago Tory minister. And in a polite diplomatic way, it keeps saying the British government isn't doing anything like enough. And, you know, lest you think I'm being party political here, I'm going to quote to you a quote from the House of Lords budget debate yesterday. And the quote is, and this is not me speaking, it's someone else. We face two crises because we're also facing a climate crisis. I do not think that this budget addresses the climate crisis in the way we need to. Every fiscal event must now be directed towards achieving our climate objectives. Now, as I said, that's not me. That's Lord Landsey, former Conservative Health Secretary, speaking in the budget debate yesterday. And one of the encouraging things, and I always like to be positive, is listening to that budget debate from all sides of the House, including quite a few of our new Tories. And we had 5 maiden speakers in one debate, which is really unusual. Everyone is now talking green in the UK. We do have climate change deniers in the House, but they no longer feel like they can appear in the House and deliver their climate change denial. So we have made real progress in the past few years. You know, the UK was just about one of the last places in the world where major mainstream outlets gave climate change deniers an outlet, and that's now changed, and everyone's now talking green. What we're not doing, however, is getting to the point where we're delivering on green, and we don't have a government that's got the kind of coherent kind of package that Emily was presenting there. Now, if we ask what the government has, there's a couple of key things to point to, and I'll get to the Environment Bill, but you know, what we're talking about is there a plan? We have the 10-point green industrial plan, which basically looks like something that someone wrote on the back of an envelope, and then some civil servants got given to turn it into something that vaguely looks like an official government document. One of the things it doesn't address, for example, is the issue of steel, which we might like to discuss this, the whole issue around the proposed new coal mine in Cumbria, what year are we in, is all related to the steel industry. Now, we had our Green Party conference last weekend, and we passed a motion there saying that we want to go entirely to recycled steel. And one of the things that needs to be talked about a lot more is about 4/5 of our scrap steel in the UK is actually exported to parts of the world that have very poor carbon and other environmental standards. A lot of it goes to Turkey. And if we actually kept our steel here and recycled it in renewable energy powered arc furnaces, we could essentially be self-sufficient in steel. Now that's something that could be in that document that isn't. There's also, and I've got it sitting here handily beside me, the energy white paper, powering our net zero future, which is supposed to be a plan. It's got lots of papers and lots of chapters in it. But one of the things that it says again and again is basically, well, one of the obvious areas of really big questions is what are we going to do about hydrogen? And perhaps we can talk about hydrogen in the discussion. And what this says about hydrogen is there's going to be a plan. That's the plan, is to have a plan. And I was actually at a really interesting event with a senior civil servant who I don't name because I fear it might get them into trouble, who came up with a really interesting slide with a list of all of the strategies that the government plans to release before the COP26 talks. And remember, they're November, which aren't that far away. The government is going to produce a heat and building strategy, a transport decarbonisation plan, Her Majesty's Treasury's net zero review, the England tree strategy, the hydrogen strategy, the industrial decarbonisation strategy, and the nature strategy. I'll draw breath after that. That's all the things that the government is supposed to be going to produce before COP, all the things that we actually don't have. Emily mentioned the Green Homes Grant, and as a case study for how not to do environmental measures or indeed social measures. The Green Homes Grant is, I'm afraid, an absolute total disaster. And it's interesting that I actually initiated a short debate on this in the Lords a week or so back, and Lord Callanan, the relevant Lords Minister, just basically said, yes, it's been a disaster. Yes. And, this is not playing for legal points. This is about the practical reality of, we have some of the worst quality of housing stock in Europe. We were talking about how much needs to be done in the EU on housing stock. Britain's is far worse on average than the rest of Western Europe. This has both environmental consequences and real human consequences. We have some of the worst excess winter deaths in Europe. Countries far colder than us, like the Scandinavians, essentially have no excess winter deaths because they have warm, insulated homes. So if you look at what, I think the Green Homes Grant is a really good case study for what's going wrong. And again, we're coming back to really the back of the envelope. Oh, we've got to do something about COVID recovery, and it should sound green. Here's throw £2 billion, throw these in. Written on the back of an envelope, administered by a US multinational company outsourcing. And basically, they were supposed to be spending £2 billion. We still haven't got the final figures, but they'll have spent a tiny fraction of that. It runs out at the end of March, and the plan for next year is to spend £320 million, a tiny fraction. And this after Lord Callanan told me that I think this was in a written answer a few months ago, and I think it's one of those cases where the civil servants just snuck in something into the answer when the minister wasn't looking, because a civil servant in that minister officially in that answer said, in this decade, in the 2020s, Britain needs to spend £68 billion on home energy efficiency. £68 billion, next year 320 million. Does not compute in any way at all. And what's the really even more frustrating thing about this is, of course, the government talks a lot about its levelling up agenda. I prefer to talk very much about a spreading out agenda. And that means spreading prosperity to every community in their land. It doesn't mean talking necessarily about big, shiny, high-tech machinery. It means insulating every home that needs it. It means jobs, small business opportunities in every community up and down the land, local jobs for local people going on endlessly. And I was at a meeting a few weeks ago, and someone said, "Oh, but what happens when we've insulated all the homes?" Well, then those jobs are going to run out. And basically, at the best possible rate you can imagine, it will take us 40 years. So I'm not really worried about the home energy efficiency jobs running out. So that's someone else's problem in 40 years' time. We'll worry about that one down the track. And if we can give people a 40-year career, I think we would be very happy with that. So that brings me then to the sort of the legal framework, the Environment Bill. And it's impossible really to look at the Environment Bill simply in its own terms, because it's all part of a package. We've already passed what's now the Agriculture Act. We've already passed what's now the Trade Act, which starts to tie into some of the stuff we're talking about Brexit. And we've got the Environment Bill, which, if you go back into the mists of time, we were told had to be passed before the end of the transition period. It hasn't been passed. We were supposed to be expecting to be dealing with it in the House of Lords about now, but because they're intending to prorogue Parliament, finish the official parliamentary year and start a new one in May, it's now been stalled, and they're not going to start looking at it until after the May elections, effectively. And they're hoping to get it done before COP. Now, there's many things to say about the Environment Bill, and it's been debated many times. I want to pick out a couple of key points, which very much ties in with the earlier presentation. One is the same fight we've been having again and again about the maintenance of standards, the maintenance of environmental standards, the maintenance of food safety standards. And you might recall during the Agriculture Act, there was the NFU, everyone from the National Farmers Union to the Green Party to the Soil Association. We were all promoting a petition, which was in the end signed by more than 1 million people, saying we want to write into the trade bill the maintenance of trade standards, which also very much relates to environmental standards. And we're talking about here, of course, the risk of importing into the UK the hideous environmental and health standards, particularly of US agriculture, and even potentially Chinese agriculture. And the government has utterly refused to do that. And we'll have the same same fight on the Environment Bill, and I'd imagine we'll have the same end result with this government. There's also the issue of environmental land management schemes, and the government talks an awful lot about nature-based solutions. And there's some real problems attached to that phrase, because very often there's two key problems, as I see it, related to environmental land management schemes and the whole approach. One is that very often what the government's talking about is, there's some bits of the country, we're going to keep them or make them really pristine and lovely. It's margins around the edges of fields. It's new patches of forest or woodlands that we're going to create. And then we're going to use industrial agriculture, huge amounts of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides on the rest of it. So it's a sparing some bits of the country and trashing the rest of them. And this is in real contrast to the EU strategy, the farm to fork strategy in the EU. Now, as I understand this, and I'm not an expert on the internal elements of European politics, this is coming from the food side of things, and it's not perhaps as binding as it would ideally be. But nonetheless, what you have is targets of saying a 50% reduction in the use of pesticides, more than doubling of organic areas, and Europe already has far more organic agriculture than we do. And so you have some really high standards there. And what's happening with the Environment Bill, and as happened with the Agriculture and the Trade Bill, the government's operating on a structure that's saying, we're not putting any details of what we're trying to achieve in the bill. This is just a framework bill. So one of the problems with the Agriculture Bill is it says all the way through, the minister can do something, and the Environment Bill is structured the same way. It doesn't say the minister has to do something, the minister should do something. It says the minister can do something. It also means, of course, the minister can do absolutely nothing, and that's not something that Client Earth or people like that will be able to take them to court for breaking the law, because there's nothing essentially in the law that you can then hold them to. So that's a real problem with the Environment Bill, as it is with the Agriculture and the Trade Bill. Now, I always believe that that dialogue's better than monologue. So I just want to say a couple more things, and then we can go to discussion. On Brexit, I think one of the things that the presentation we've just had demonstrated very clearly is anyone who tells you that Brexit is done is utterly talking through their hat. Brexit has just barely been started. And if you look at the wrestles that are going on now around the Northern Ireland Protocol, I've been thinking back a lot to, I was speaking, would have been about 2017, at a Green Christian festival in a tent in a field somewhere in the Midlands. I've forgotten where now. And someone was attacking the Institute for Economic Affairs speaker beside me, who was a young woman, because she was asked, what will we do about Ireland? She said, oh, I don't know, but we'll find something. And I leapt up to defend her because I don't like to see young women speakers being attacked. And I said, no, I mean, she's absolutely right. There is no answer to the Ireland border problem. And, you know, it's increasingly obvious that there is no answer to the Ireland border problem. There has to be a border somewhere. The border has actually been put down the middle of the Irish Sea, and that's throwing up huge problems for the UK. But we can't have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And of course, Ireland's not going to accept a border between it and the rest of the EU. So there is no other solution. And that's going to be a huge ongoing and very dangerous wrangle. And there's a huge problem with the government talking very much, I mean, the whole issue of free ports, an absolutely disastrous policy that the government's running with, which is basically an idea of deregulation, open slather. And that's, you know, the EU is rightly very concerned about tax dodging issues associated with them. You know, this is going to be a huge area of ongoing wrangles, but there's just so much that's still to be sorted out. Now, finally, because I feel like I've been too depressing, and on a Saturday morning in particular, I feel like I've got to find out something positive to finish on. So what I'll just mention is there's something some people might have heard of called the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. And this is before the Commons now. Caroline Lucas, Green MP, is supporting it, but it's cross-party. There's people from, I'm not sure if there's any Tories. I think might be a Tory in there, people supporting it. And the Climate Change Act, of course, in 2008, you'll still hear our government all of the time going, we were the pioneers, we passed this act in 2008. And okay, it has been updated in terms of the targets, but nonetheless, proclaiming what you achieved in 2008 is still your great achievement in 2021, you know, is not a very positive thing. So what we have is the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which is a private bill, but it's proposing to really update this and bring in something that I think that the previous presentation brought in really well. What we have to do is think in a systems kind of way. We have to join all of these things up. We can't just think about climate. We can't just think about nature. We can't just think about the plastics problem. We have an utterly broken economic, political, industrial system. Everything has to change. But the positive thing about that is that the growth economy we've had, the fossil fuel-based economy we've had, has been trashing the planet and creating a thoroughly miserable, unequal, poverty-stricken, insecure, unstable society. And the changes that we have to make are also changes to make our society much better for people as well as for planet. So on that positive note, I'll wind up and look forward to the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I noticed you got the word wrangle in there. I'm not sure if that's because I asked you before we started if you'd wrangled any horses on your farm. So thank you, Emilien, as well. There's both two great presentations, lots of information there. And I think we'll just throw it open to the floor. If you could put your hand up, Hazel's going to kind of keep an eye on who puts their hand up. And some people, it might be under reactions, and depending on the version of Zoom you've got, so have a hunt around. We have got a couple of people who asked questions in advance. So I think Nigel Lloyd, are you there? Nigel?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Would you like to ask your question, Nigel?
Why don't you read it out? Because I need to dig it out. Otherwise, I can dig it out.
So Nigel wanted to ask, what can pro-EU groups do to make the most impact on the climate emergency? How can we collaborate, unite? Since we now have Brexit, should we combine to fight the climate emergency as the best way to reunite ties with Europe? Let me see if I can put that in the chat. Natalie, would you like, I mean, that's probably best aimed at you, as it's a kind of a political type question. Would you?
Sure. I mean, I think, I kind of finished by talking about systems thinking, you know, a sustainable development goal kind of approach. And I think that joined upness is really good. I think the challenge is and this also applies for people in England, referring to Scotland and Wales, is we often look to the EU, as I've been doing this morning, just from England, look to Scotland and Wales and say, oh, you're doing so much better than we are in England. And that kind of almost upsets people in Scotland, Wales and the EU, because they say, but we're not doing nearly good well enough. So I think the answer is to collectively say we've all got to do better. And if you start from that basis, and also say, you know, we can learn from each other. I don't think the British government really has much in climate strategies, environmental strategies, much to point. You know, can say we're world leading in all the wrong directions, is what I often say in Parliament. But I think getting together with people, talking about these things, being awareness of these things. And I think what's really important is focusing on hope and focusing on how we can get together and do things almost often despite the government rather than because of it. And actually, I was at a meeting of the all-party parliamentary group on British-French relations, or something it's called, with a mixture of French and British politicians. And one of the things that they were talking about, which I hadn't really thought about before, was how before Britain was a member of the EU or preceding organisations, there was a lot of schools linked up, a French school linked up with a British or English school. There was a lot of, you know, twinning arrangements between towns and cities. And one of the things I think that people can really constructively do is look to actually to restore, to revive, to renew, to create those kind of person-to-person, community-to-community links. And I think that's something that people can do as individuals or as small groups of people, and actually just reach out and build understanding and knowledge of what's happening in different places. And I think one of the things that's really important to do is, I mean, perhaps, you know, for example, France, traditionally, there's a lot of links and that's the closest. But we don't have many traditional links with Eastern Europe. And I think we could really valuably try, you know, reach out and try and make some links, you know, an environmental group or a group like this here, find a group in Poland somewhere to reach out to and make some links. And those human links could be really important and really positive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I think we've got, I know we've got a question. Dunk has under the pseudonym of Vicky Parker was waving his hand at the beginning. If you want to do your question, if you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, the space bar normally unmutes, but it wasn't today for some reason. So yeah, my question is actually for Emilien, but before that, I would just like to thank Natalie so much for not making it a political discussion and not saying that, of course, you can vote for the Green Party in May. And I'm really glad she didn't say any of that and push that silly message. But my question for Emilien is, if all that comes out of the European work on the environment, if that does all come to fruition and does all work, which is a huge assumption, can you give a description of the level of degradation of the environment and of the condition of the planet at 2050? I still don't have a feeling for, if we are successful, where we will be. Can you kind of describe that?
Thanks for the question. It's a very broad question. It's much easier to describe the level of damage now. You know, typically the fact that only 16% of habitats are in a good conservation state, or only 23% of species are not threatened in any way on the scale. What we want to have achieved, at least in the coming years, typically for 2028, we have an objective of good quality waters throughout the EU. In terms of exact targets for 2050, we only have the net zero. The rest is this little bit more large description I gave, this objective of living well within the planetary limits. But yeah, what is true is that we have ample evidence that the level right now is absolutely concerning and that we need to act very fast.
If I can just come in on that too, I mean, one of the things I think is inevitably when we're talking about all of these things, we're talking about technology, and we don't really start to address the ways in which societies can change. and social practices, economic practices can change. So, for example, if you think about what happened at the start of the COVID lockdown a year ago, the world suddenly changed almost overnight. We went from 5% of British people working from home to 50% of people working from home. And what all of these plans don't take in is the kind of social changes that I believe we're going to have to see. If we take a very obvious one, a 4-day working week is standard with no loss of pay, is something that's really been growing and developing as an idea enormously over the last couple of years. Now that has a real environmental impact. You think about how much less travel that will involve in normal times, at least. If you think about universal basic income, a long time policy that the Green Party's been championing, that now is catching on right around the political spectrum and is catching on right around the country. A universal basic income that gives people security, that feels like they don't have to keep striving for more and more because people are seeking that security. People can choose to say, I can afford to take a few years off, care for an elderly relative, get a community garden up and going in my community, up my street. People can live their lives differently. We tend to very much with all of these models look as business as usual with added technology. What we actually want to do is change to a different kind of society that delivers better for people and planet. And something like reduced working hours, reduced working days is something that's very hard to model and very hard to include, but is the kind of rapid social change that COVID is showing is perfectly possible.
Thank you, Natalie. Next up is Judy Mason. You've got your hand raised if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, I had a question for Emilien. First of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. The targets for the EU Green Deal, why has the EU recently changed its ultimate carbon target from 0 to net zero? And this was done without any announcement, I believe. And what it takes you into is the land of offset. So we're all talking about net zero, which trips off the tongue very nicely. But actually, it doesn't mean zero carbon. It means that there's going to be a lot of offsets, which are then very difficult to police. And we shall still be producing loads of carbon, but saying, hopefully, that we're offsetting it. So why have you gone from 0 to net zero?
No, so first, you're absolutely right that the target is net zero, and that recognizes that we won't have absolutely reduced emissions to zero. There'll always be a little extra that needs to be compensated one way or the other. But on the issue of offsetting and compensation, I think that's an area where the EU has been really strong, at least pushing typically on the aviation and on the maritime front. There are discussions at ICAO and the International Maritime Organization that's based in London. These are sectors that want and have wanted historically to base their climate effort on offsetting. And unfortunately, a lot of that offsetting in the past was poor quality. You don't know where exactly these offsetting credits come from, what's their additionality, as we call it, meaning would there have been an action regardless, or is the action really new, this offsetting, planting new trees, typically. So what we're pushing through systematically through these forums, if you like, is to have credible offsetting schemes. And that offsetting is not at the core of the movement. So that's the case for aviation. We cannot have a way forward that's only looking at offsetting and not at other aspects, whether it's better management of circulation, whether it's more sustainable fuels, etc., whether it's proper taxation of flights, an area we're pushing. You may know that at least intra-EU flights are covered by the EU emissions trading scheme. So the airlines have to purchase their right to pollute from the rest of the market, and that's an ever shrinking market, so it's more and more expensive for them. And that's also something we want to apply to flights coming in and out of the EU to other zones. And I should say that's one area, at least where the deal is pretty good, is that UK flights would still be concerned by this coverage. Voila. Before we forget it, I noticed in the chat that there's been for a long time now a question by Jill on the question of chemicals. And here as well, good news and bad news on the relation on chemicals. The good news is that there is an annex in the trade deal that says, yes, chemicals can still flow tariff-free, quota-free between the UK and the EU. But of course, that's not all there is to it. There's also the question of data. What do we know about these chemicals? And no, indeed, the UK is no longer in the European Chemicals Agency, is no longer the REACH system. And that does mean, for now at least, that chemical companies that want to put substances on both markets now have to go through 2 registration systems. So they have to pay twice for the studies, to demonstrate, to register their products, to even if at the end of the day we're talking about the exact same substance. That's the current status quo.
And that actually, I did before Christmas, I did one of those incredibly detailed, technical sounding statutory instruments, the House of Lords debates. But one of the things I learnt from that is the same thing applies to cosmetics. The registration of all cosmetics, there's now 2 parallel registration systems. And when you actually start to dig into the detail of this, it's absolutely horrendous. You think about how many sort of small independent companies, which essentially someone in their kitchen started making, you know, lovely organic handmade cosmetics, the kind of things you see advertised on the internet quite a lot. And they've got to have a official responsible person, and that's a legal term, in the EU if they want to sell their products into the EU anymore. And so you're starting up your nice little small independent company, which is basically you in your kitchen. And if you want to, you know, put your stuff up on the internet, and once you could have sold it into the EU very simply through 1 registration system, you've got to jump through 2 complete set of legal hoops to be able to do that. So that's, you know, some of the demonstration of costs of Brexit.
Thank you both. We had a question emailed in earlier from Barry Noble. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask it, Barry. Otherwise I can.
Thank you. Thanks to the speakers and also the organisers of the meeting. I think you're doing a super job. My question's about the environment, which has sort of been, well, it's been talked about a lot, but sort of not been answered. I'm pretty long in the tooth and I've always been concerned about very poor environmental standards in the UK. And we've had a very ham-fisted approach to trying to improve things like the pursuit of reducing carbon, which is highly important, but we've always done it by things like carbon offsetting or alternatively switching to burning more oil, importing huge quantities of wood to burn in wood-burning stoves in the UK. Totally wrong approach, and I'm pretty sceptical about trying to solve these problems in the future unless we have a complete rethink. But having said all that, can I just very briefly say about Brexit? Natalie made the point that Brexit is not done, and unless we go back to the EU, it'll never be done in my view. But I think what we need to be doing is really working hard to not only meet the EU standards, but in the UK to try and improve them, because there's an awful lot to be done and there's so much greenwashing going on. The politicians need to be called to account, and I appreciate the work that you're doing in the House of Lords, but frankly, we need a lot more. My question is, how on earth can we do it? How can we achieve better results?
Well, I think one of the things is I spoke about how everyone's talking green now, and I think public awareness has grown enormously in the past 3-5 years. It's changed very much. And one of the things, I'm perhaps partly inspired by your lovely background of all of those trees there, is where we're making real progress, and you know, some great organizations like Wild Justice, for example, and we've just seen, in terms of commenting on the Environment Bill, if people haven't seen it, I'd strongly recommend you sign a petition, which is backed by a big coalition of wildlife charities calling for a nature target in the Environment Bill. And so that's like, as we have carbon targets, to have nature targets, because there's been very little understanding, although it's slowly changing, that Britain is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. These NGOs put out a report about every 2 years called the State of Nature Report. And a few years ago, they gave us an international ranking, and we were the 187th worst country in the world for nature. And people don't realise, I mean, for example, I'm a Sheffield Green Party member, the Peak District. People say, oh, isn't the Peak District pretty? Doesn't it look nice? And it's essentially a green desert. An excellent academic called Alexander Lees from Manchester comments that he walks through the centre of Manchester and he sees more birds there than he does in the Peak District. Driven grouse shooting, land management, huge amounts of Britain is managed by slaughter of almost all the species that should be there, including illegal slaughter of the raptors like hen harriers. And so building public knowledge, building public anger and frustration, and I'm very much seeing this happen. And, Wild Justice has been a very effective organisation doing this. People demanding change, and even, there's a bit of a fuss going on at the moment about how terrible lawns are for the environment, environmental damage done by lawns. And, if we can let what have been called weeds, let's change the terminology and talk about wildflowers, and let's let the wildflowers bloom everywhere we can. And so I think there are positive changes happening in public opinion. The government is way, way behind. I mean, I years ago wrote a piece about plastics, saying the government was utterly in the lead on attitudes to try to reduce, the public was utterly in the lead. The companies were following the public, and the government was way down in third place. So on lots of these issues, the public is actually ahead. And we had a climate assembly just as COVID was starting last March. And the public in that climate assembly called for much faster action than the government was delivering. So that's, a message of positivity. The public is really getting this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Next with their hand up is John Pickering, JP. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Thanks, Hazel. Very quick. Thanks to both speakers. Brilliant, if a bit sobering. If there was more pressure through financial services to divest from dragging hydrocarbons out of the ground, you'd be hacking at the roots of the problem rather than taking off branches above ground, if you'll forgive the metaphor. My question is I suppose it's first of all to Emilien, is there anything in the EU's plan towards 2050 to really, put not just token, but real pressure on pension funds and hedge funds and so on to pull money away from financing getting hydrocarbons out of the ground, leave them in the ground? So a bit of a rant, but a question.
Yeah, thank you, John. No, it's that's a very legitimate question, and you're touching on one of the key issues here. Two things. First, cleaning up our own act. So the European Investment Bank, for instance, has revised its own lending criteria to move away from fossil fuel and from investments that are damaging for the environment. That was already, I think, a year and a half ago, and it's being implemented. Secondly, on the wider finance world, yes, as part of the Green Deal, one of the key legs of the Green Deal is a sustainable finance action plan. And under that, we have key measures, and it's looking like we will be the first to propose that. A series of things. First, what we call a green taxonomy. So it's quite technical, but it's the idea of revising in an independent manner what constitutes a green investment and what is not. And at the end of the day, as there is a push more and more for institutional players to only invest in at least non-harmful solutions, this kind of government-approved taxonomies and not some greenwashing by a specific private institution, we believe that will start becoming the reference, and that has the potential to shift hundreds of billions away from projects that are harmful to the environment. We also have the first green bonds program that was launched last year, and the UK is following in some respect. And an area where the UK and the EU are cooperating is this international platform on sustainable finance to push these principles to other big financial places, because however big London, Paris, Amsterdam, etc. are, they're not the full picture. Voilà. Speaking of which, I wanted to also comment on one thing Natalie said on the abundance of strategies, strategy this, strategy that in the UK. And you could tell almost the same, of course, from what I've presented. We have a Green Deal, but then we have the biodiversity strategy, farm to fork strategy, etc., now the sustainable finance action plan. And that's a risk that was very clear from the get-go, typically for the president, that we do not want to have a Russian dolls system, if you like, where you have a Green Deal, which itself leads to one strategy, the strategy leads to an action plan, etc., etc., etc. And before the mandate is over, all you've done is meta papers and not actual actions. So what they've said is that's it. You can have one strategy per sector, if you like. So we have one on, like I said, on agriculture, one on biodiversity, and that's it. They must include very concrete actions. You don't have more action plans within a strategy, etc. And I think that's a very positive development. You could see when I was still in Brussels, the institutional, I wouldn't say resistance, but how much the institution had to learn to do this, to be as concrete as possible, not kick throw the ball further. And that's why you see concrete targets on biodiversity, concrete proposals on sustainable products, products that would be removed from the market, etc., etc. The idea is really to, by the time the mandate of the president ends in 2024, the idea is to have had many concrete, palatable developments, not just, like I said, these Russian dolls strategies.
Thank you, Emilien. Next, I can see Albert Ria has had his hand up. Before it drops off, we'll come to you next.
Okay, thanks. It's Albert Ray.
Oh, sorry.
Ray. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. I'd just like to raise the issue of the regulation of human activity, because we used to have a universal Green Day, and it was called Sunday. Religious observance is a very low carbon activity. I'm not saying this from the point of view of religion. I'm saying it from the point of view that on a Sunday, I don't know of any facts and figures from the past, but I would imagine that Sundays were a very, very low polluting day. And from the lockdown periods to COVID, they were periods which did give nature a little rest and a little chance recovery, if we do look at that. I lived 10 years resident in France. And in France, even though they had a non-religious revolution, Sunday in the 21st century in France is much more a rest day than it is in the UK. And I think that if we thought that we could have, if you like, pan-European rest days of the week, because we used to have this in the past. We used to have a working week, we used to have a weekend, and we used to have a half day. And on the rest days, I would imagine that they were very, very low, the polluting periods of the week.
I think this very much relates to what I was saying is the 4-day working week as standard. And in fact, yesterday I retweeted someone from the 4-day working week campaign. He'd put up very proudly a picture of a park bench that he'd built on his 5th day of the week, where instead of actually, going to paid work, he'd done a bit of community effort to build this park bench. And so I very much agree with you. And you made the religious comparison. I don't have exact figures on this, but actually one of the things that happened with the Protestant Reformation is in the traditional Catholic medieval times, there was a huge number of feast days on which people didn't work, and probably people did about a 3-day working week, in a lot of the medieval times. And we've got to this, we actually come to the question of what's the economy for? And we've come to a point where people tend to think of, we've all got to be here to serve the economy, which is utterly the wrong way around. What we want to do is have an economy that serves us. And if we eventually, the New Economics Foundation did some work looking at a 3-day working week as standard. And if we did that, then we'd be totally changing around our idea of, no one lies on their deathbed and goes, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. And I think there's a real trade-off to be had here. We've been chasing economic growth to have more stuff, and that's been the ambition. Every time the GDP figures come out and they've gone up, people go, oh great, isn't it wonderful, we've got more stuff. Essentially, that's what the underlying thing means. Let's change it round and gradually reduce the working week and say, we've won more time. We've made real progress. I have more time to spread in the grandkids. I have more time to spend in the garden. And, the UK has, on average, pre-COVID, obviously, twice the average commuting time as the rest of Europe. We also have twice the average consumption of ready meals. And we have the second longest working hours in Europe behind Greece. And if you think about what that means about people's lives, it means you've worked a 10-hour day with, 2 hours of overtime unpaid. You've possibly commuted 2 hours at each end of that 10-hour day. You've staggered off the bus or the train exhausted at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. in the evening. You've fallen into the Tesco Metro or the Sainsbury's local or whatever, picked up your plastic wrapped, thoroughly unhealthy ready meal and chucked it in the microwave when you got through the door. And we also have the highest rate of marriage breakdown in Europe. All of those things point to a really unhealthy society, and a society that's headed in entirely the wrong direction. So, I think you're very much right, but I wouldn't just go for Sundays or weekends. I want 3-day weekends as standard.
Yeah, we also have the lowest productivity.
Thank you for that. If we move on to Louisa, I think you've got a question if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'd be interested to know if anyone, or is there any way I could follow Italy's preparations as co-host of COP26. I mean, my schoolgirl Italian is far too rusty to be able to follow the proceedings in a newspaper or on telly. But I seem to know if there's any way of I mean, I'm not optimistic. I don't expect that the British media is going to report on it, because there's unwritten rule that you only report on Italy when it's to do with holidays, cuisine, or mafia, or the mafia, and the rest of it, forget it.
Emilien, do you know if there's anything available in English for us to follow, perhaps?
I can do several things with that. First, if you email me, I can give you the email of my my counterpart in the Italian embassy, who has a good overview of this. And basically, yes, Italy is co-hosting COP26. It's not just the UK alone; it's the UK and Italy. Even if, of course, physically it's going to take place in Glasgow. And the way they're sharing the responsibilities is that Italy will host what we call the pre-COP summit. So in Milano, just before COP in Glasgow. That's to make as much progress as possible on the hardcore negotiations, if you like, so that when the negotiators arrive in Glasgow, a lot has been pre-hashed. And Italy will also host the Youth COP. So that's a new thing. That's the COP for youth movements. And we know that the youth movements have taken a big role in the climate fight in the past years. And I do know, but there again, my Italian counterpart would tell you much more. I do know that, of course, they're working a lot together, and also through the UN, FCC, the meetings they have in Bonn and virtually. And they are organizing events as well, virtual events for now for the general public. So I'm happy to either to you or to Hazel to send what I have from the colleagues here.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can pass that on, or if you put something in the chat, that's fine. And another question we've got from Barbara Dundas. You'd like to unmute yourself and ask?
Well, first of all, it's not Barbara who actually asked the question. She's sitting next to me. She signed it
I can only see Barbara written.
My concern about this very, very useful webinar, I was actually one of the local area organisers for the Remain campaign, to nail my colours to the mast. However, we have a problem in the UK, and the problem is 29 years to get to net zero carbon emissions. And although I support all of these concerns about local environmental situations concerning trees and farms and all the rest of it, we only have 29 years to get there. And today, less than 10% of the energy that this country requires comes from renewable sources. That is enormous. And the task of making it 100% from green energy sources is absolutely huge. And my concern, as I said, as a consultant, by the way, I do also consult with a number of parliamentary committees and people who are involved in the action end of trying to mitigate climate change, is that people think too much in silos. So you get the people who are generating energy, they're in their silo, and the people who are building cars, they're in their silo, and so on and so forth. But the critical thing is, where does our energy come from? And actually, in terms of figures, if anyone wants to write this down, the primary energy production in this country to produce and to power our economy and allow us to live in a civilized way is 2,226 terawatt hours. And that's statistics from the BIS. And only 15% of that comes from electricity. And of that, about 8% comes from green electricity. Now you can increase your green energy from the so-called renewables, wind power, solar, tidal, and so on, maybe 5 or even 6 times, but that is still so short of the total. And we need to start looking at the sums and saying, what do we have to achieve in 29 years? And I'm going to say something here which I'd imagine a high proportion of people here will not like. The only other source of clean energy that we can possibly have, and I can see Natalie smiling, is nuclear power. Now, people don't like that, but the fact is, nuclear power in this country over the years has been extremely safe. It's much safer than other forms of energy. And our nuclear power is pretty good. Now, the problem is around the world, places like Chernobyl, it is not good, and that gives it a bad name. But there is no other source. Well, that's not entirely true. There is one source, potentially, and that is to import green hydrogen from places like Saudi Arabia. And something that, for example, the German economy, Germans understand, they don't have enough renewable energy to meet all energy requirements. They're preparing all their North Sea ports to import bulk hydrogen from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is building a city to actually generate that using solar power. We don't have enough solar power, so we might actually import some of that from Saudi Arabia. But if you look at the sums and what's possible, nuclear power's got to be part of the equation, but it has to be safe nuclear power. Would you like to comment, Natalie, please?
I would be delighted to comment. And where I would start with is what you're putting forward is essentially business as usual with added technology. So you're assuming that a society that needs the same kind of levels of energy as we have now. Now, I was talking, there's a real reason why I major a lot on home energy efficiency. It's perfectly possible and indeed necessary to essentially convert our housing stock, retrofit our housing stock, and build new houses now that make passive house or equivalent kind of standards. If it's -10 outside, you can keep that entire house warm with the equivalent of 1 bar electric radiator. The cleanest, greenest, cheapest, best possible energy you can have is the energy you don't need to use. And if you're looking, for example, changes in transport, the best possible transport you can have is active transport, walking and cycling. And we're seeing, for example, in Paris, the Paris mayor is really inspired and working on the idea of the 15-minute city. So the idea is that everything you need on a day-to-day basis is within a 15-minute cycle of your home. So we get away from the kind of hypermobility, which has created all of some of the problems I was talking about in terms of, 2-hour commute stuck on a train with your face in someone else's armpit each day. That's where the kind of things
Natalie
we're using.
Bennett.
We're using energy on someone. Yeah. So we have to go to a much lower energy using society, but it is possible. And if you look, for example, at the Centre for Alternative Technology has done a lot of work on this on Zero Carbon Britain, which is entirely renewably powered. It has been done, it's controversial, unsurprisingly, but there's been work done to show around the world that you can run the world on 100% renewable energy. And that does mean electrification. But I mean, one of the case studies is, the government talks a lot about electric cars and has, a reasonably decent standard of ending the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030. but the government's vision is very clearly a one-for-one replacement. Whereas I would say what we need to do is go to something like a 1 for 10 kind of replacement, rather than private individual cars. Go to a car club kind of setup where there's a car available to you when you really need a car. But the rest of the time, you know, the average car sits vacant, sits still for 90% plus of the time. And if you're not putting all the energy into making all of those cars to sit around on the road and occupy your space in your cities. I mean, I went and visited Ghent, the Belgian city, and they've essentially got rid of cars from their city centre. And one of the things they've done is lots of those former car parking spaces are now actually children's playgrounds. And so then there's a children's playground, you know, right outside people's windows. The kids from quite a young age can go and play outside, and you can imagine all the positive benefits that flow from that. But specifically on nuclear, I mean, I don't think I need to argue about safety or cost on nuclear, although there is very powerful arguments on safety and cost. For me, the key argument with nuclear is it is way, way too slow. You can stick solar panels on your roof next week. You can build a wind farm in a year or two. Solar and solar and wind are now the cheapest sources of electricity. They're available. I can quote the head of the National Grid, who in 2015 said baseload power is dead. The baseload for domestic use will be solar panels on people's roof and a battery in the kitchen. That's the future, and it's a decentralized, far more resilient system. New nuclear, at the best possible you could possibly imagine, highly unlikely you could deliver it in 10 years' time. The problem is that's just way, way too slow. We need to turn this all around now. And if you look at the cost curves and you know, for example, on solar, it's gone, the cost has just gone down enormously. But number one for policy has to be reduction, reuse. Number two is renewables. And then we need a society that fits within those frameworks.
May I answer? First of all, I would point out, Natalie, and thanks very much for that. I agree with the whole concept that we have to do things differently, but we only have 29 years to do it. And the main point is you need to look at the figures. How are we going to bridge this huge gap with the kind of renewable energy we have today and what we're going to need in the future? And there are one or two big situations. You mentioned steel. I remember when you were talking about recycling steel. I think that's a good idea. But even then you recycle, you still got to smelt the steel down and melt it down and reuse it. So you need energy. And producing, for example, cement, you cannot avoid the fact that that is a huge use of energy. We just simply don't have enough possibilities of changing the manufacture of steel, the manufacture of cement, industrial processes to be able to slow or to make the gap smaller for the energy we need. We've got 29 years to do it. Now, on terms of nuclear, building a nuclear power station like Hinkley Point C, you're absolutely right, it takes years. It's going to take 10 years. What we need is the nuclear reactors which are made in factories, mass produced, the small modular reactors, which are a reality. And they will do the job much better, because how are you going to retrofit your existing gas-fired power stations? You need a renewable source of energy to supply the heat. But the only way of doing that is a small nuclear reactor.
I won't turn this into a debate, but just to briefly respond, I'm actually going to quote someone from industry who was talking about what a transformatory factor electric cars will be. Because when you buy, if you haven't bought it already, when you buy your first electric car, if you haven't already got solar panels on your roof, you will almost certainly buy solar panels with that electric car and the battery, because that's the way in which you essentially fuel that car for nothing. What you can also do, and what's increasingly being done, is what's known as vehicle to grid. So that electric car, the battery storage in your electric car actually becomes part of the grid storage. And I actually saw this 5-6 years ago in down in Cornwall at the Eden project. And they already had a scheme whereby their company cars were electric. They were hooked into the grid. And when there wasn't, when it was cloudy and the solar panels on the roof to run the office weren't generating much, the computer knew that, Fred's car, well, on Tuesday, he usually takes the kids to soccer practice, football practice, so he's going to need a certain amount of energy, but we'll draw the rest of the energy out of that car battery to run the office. So what you've got is an idea of, not energy being there just to use as and when, managing demand as well as managing supply and demand being the same things. It's an utter transformation of the system. It's not taking the model and just saying, right, this is the amount of energy. We have to find some way to generate it all by renewables. Renewables, will generate a huge amount, but it's also changing the entire system. And just to feed in finally, and perhaps we better stop and not dominate, but I don't think we have 29 years. I think we have to go to zero carbon by 2030. And that's talking about truly transformatory change. And nuclear is absolutely useless for that, because there's no new nuclear in by 2030.
We need to be very ambitious, there's no doubt about it. And I admire your persistence on that. But I would say to everybody, look at the figures. We've got 29 years to do it. Can we change the way people do things in 29 years? Oh, and by the way, we have an electric car. So, we understand that. And our house is extremely well insulated. We do all our bits to do this. But nevertheless, when you come down to it, industry and the heating of public buildings and so on is beyond our control. And by 2050,
I think we're going to come to a resolution
by electricity.
I'm just going to say March 2020, COVID. Look how fast things turned around then.
Right. Has anyone else got any other questions? Or, we've already run a bit over time as it is. So if anyone has, pop your hand up quickly. Otherwise, I think we can probably leave it there. Oh, hang on. Sorry.
Thank you. I don't want to keep you, obviously, it went over. But is there any EU policy about bottled water, or because it is a big issue with pollution and everything else? And again, I believe that the water industry should be nationalized, but that's a different issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, it's part of our plastic strategy and the single-use plastics directive. So the first targets we have, I believe, for 2025 are to systematize the recycling. We have some countries that have good experiences with, how do you call them? Places where you can return these bottles and get a few cents. Not every country has that. So that's the kind of scheme that's encouraged through the directive. At the end of the day, member states can produce, can proceed how they want, but they have to reach one way or the other the targets of reducing the number of plastic waste, including from bottles. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. If that's all, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to Emilien and Natalie for joining us. And I hope you've all found it very useful. And perhaps I might save some of the links and perhaps send an email out to everyone who attended, just in case there's any information there that people want. And obviously the event was recorded, so we will make a link available to it in case you want to watch it back, or if someone was unable to attend and would like to watch it. Is that all, Peter?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you again for talking to us. There was so much in both your presentations, and we'll have to see how the UK and the EU continue to talk and hopefully cooperate in the future. But thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Emilien.